Did you know that the official founding of San Francisco in 1776 actually happened just a few days before the American Declaration of Independence?
Oh, wow, really? That close?
Yeah, it really highlights, its deep roots and how it kind of emerged right alongside the United States itself.
That's fascinating. Puts it in perspective.
Welcome to Seeking History. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the enduring story of San Francisco. We're exploring its incredible history of constant change and how that past really shapes its present day.
It truly is a city defined by transformation, often really rapid, dramatic change. And its geography, that unique peninsula, has always been fundamental.
Right, the location itself.
Exactly. Being tucked onto that bay, rich with harbors,
Right.
it's consistently dictated its strategic importance. Whether you're talking indigenous trade, the Spanish missions, or later, global commerce.
But let's go way back. What was this area like before any Europeans showed up?
Well, before the Spanish colonizers arrived, the San Francisco Bay Area was incredibly vibrant, a densely populated world.
Oh.
Yeah, estimates suggest around 10,000 native people lived here. Many distinct communities, but the Ohlone are probably the best-known group.
And their life was really tied to the land.
Absolutely. Deeply connected. They had this sophisticated hunter-gatherer lifestyle, making full use of the rich resources: deer, fish, shellfish from the bay, acorns, berries, you name it.
So living off the land.
But more than that, they were active managers of it. One really interesting practice was controlled burning of old growth each year.
Why would they do that?
Well, it helped improve seed yields, cleared underbrush, basically shaped the landscape to be more productive for them. They lived sustainably. Their dwellings, like woven tucal houses near the bay or redwood bark structures inland, were perfectly adapted.
And they had social networks, spiritual practices?
Oh, yeah. Complex social networks, trade, intermarriage between groups, and a rich spiritual life, possibly centered around what scholars call the Kuksu religion, known for its ritual dances and shamans. It was a balanced way of life that had worked for thousands of years.
And then the arrival of Europeans changed everything, fundamentally.
It did, and with devastating speed. The Spanish colonizers arrived in 1769. That marked this profound, often violent, turning point.
And San Francisco itself.
Juan Bautista de Anza's expedition reached the peninsula in March 1776. He was scouting locations very strategically. He chose sites for the Presidio, the military base, and a mission near a lagoon they called Laguna de los Dolores.
Mission Dolores.
Exactly. The official founding mass was held right there on June 29th, 1776. And then the mission San Francisco de Asís, named for St. Francis, was formally dedicated on October 9th by Father Serra.
So these weren't just random settlements. They had very specific goals.
Precisely. The Presidios were about military control, asserting Spanish authority. The missions, though, were the engine of cultural and conquest. The goal was converting native peoples to Christianity and integrating them into the Spanish colonial system.
And San Francisco was sort of the edge of their reach.
Pretty much the northern limit of Spain's expansion in California. But establishing it kicked off the most fundamental shift in the region's entire history. It began the process of dismantling a way of life that had existed for millennia.
And the human cost of that dismantling.
Oh, it was immense. Catastrophic is probably the right word. Indigenous people were forcibly moved into the mission settlements. These were called reductions.
Reduction?
Yeah, reducing their territory and forcing them into controlled communities. This completely shattered their traditional social structures, their connection to their lands, their whole way of life.
And disease must have been rampant.
Terrible. The close quarters, poor sanitation. It was fertile ground for European diseases like smallpox and measles. Native populations had zero immunity.
Are there records of specific outbreaks?
Yes, grim ones, like a measles epidemic in 1806 that killed about a quarter of the native population at the Bay Area missions in just a few months.
A quarter? That's staggering loss.
And it wasn't just disease. Historical accounts also detail abuse, malnutrition, brutal overwork within the mission system. The native population at the missions just plummeted down to maybe 2,500 by 1830.
Did they resist?
Absolutely. People resisted. They fled the missions when they could, sometimes returning to the interior. There were documented instances of rebellion, too. But ultimately, this systematic effort to erase their culture and control their lives led to what historians call the virtual destruction of the Indians themselves.
You mentioned ecology earlier. Was there an environmental impact, too?
Yes, and it acted as another form of control, maybe less direct but just as powerful. The Spanish brought European livestock, cattle, horses, sheep, pigs.
Animals that weren't native here.
Right, and these animals grazed heavily, leading to massive overgrazing of the native grasses that deer and other local game depended on.
Ah, so it disrupted the native food sources.
Exactly. This ecological shift gradually gave the missions a near monopoly over the food supply. It subtly, but very effectively, pressured the Ohlone and others to join the missions and adopt European farming just to survive. It forced them away from their traditional economy. Environmental control as a tool for assimilation.
So that Spanish era eventually ends. Mexico gains independence. What changes then?
Right. Mexico becomes independent from Spain in 1821. California becomes this remote northern province. And pretty quickly, Mexican liberals, influenced by Enlightenment ideas, started calling for the missions to be secularized.
Secularized, meaning taken away from the church.
Yes. They viewed the missions as unconstitutional, holding natives in servitude and controlling vast amounts of land. Governor Jose Figueroa issued the official secularization proclamation in 1834.
And the idea was to free the native people, give them land.
That was the stated goal, yes. Emancipate the indigenous populations, distribute the mission lands, with some supposedly going to the natives themselves.
But that's not quite how it played out.
Not at all. In reality, the vast bulk of the mission lands, we're talking prime coastal real estate, ended up in the hands of a small elite group of California families, often through political connections and land grants.
So the rise of the ranchos.
Exactly. The era of the massive cattle ranches, the California ranchos. For the native population, it was effectively just another form of dispossession. They received very little of the land they'd lived on and worked for generations.
And this Mexican period ends with the U.S. taking over.
Yes, the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. It culminates in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 48, where Mexico cedes California to the United States.
1848. And that date, of course, brings us to the other major event that really put San Francisco on the map.
Oh, absolutely. The game changer. The discovery of gold by James W. Marshall.
At Sutter's Mill.
Right, January 24th, 1848. Once word got out, it unleashed this just unbelievable wave of immigration. Maybe 300,000 people flooded into California in just a few years. From all over the U.S., all over the world.
And it wasn't just a California thing, right? It affected the whole country.
Definitely. It had this invigorating effect on the entire American economy, pumping huge amounts of new gold into the system.
And San Francisco itself just exploded.
It is the right word. Right. It went from this sleepy port town, maybe less than 1,000 people in 1846, to still only about 1,000 in early 48 before the news really hit. Then boom, 25,000 by 1850, 50,000 by 1856.
So that kind of growth is almost unimaginable today, let alone then.
Astonishing, truly meteoric for the 19th century. You just had this instant city appearing almost out of nowhere.
Must have been chaotic.
Utter chaos, makeshift structures everywhere. Tents, wooden shacks, quickly thrown up hotels and saloons. Infrastructure couldn't possibly keep pace.
But its location was key.
Absolutely critical. That spot on Yerba Buena Cove gave it this huge head start. It became the chief port of arrival and transfer for almost everyone and everything heading to the goldfield.
The main gateway.
Exactly. The logistical hub, the center of commerce. It very quickly became the de facto capital and the first real major city in California. That geography, amplified by the gold rush, set it up for future dominance.
And the early economy was all about supporting the miners.
Pretty much entirely, yeah. Businesses selling picks and shovels, food, supplies, providing lodging, entertainment, anything a prospector might need.
I heard ships were just abandoned in the harbor.
That's right. So many crews deserted to chase gold themselves. These abandoned ships were often just pulled ashore, repurposed as warehouses, shops, even hotels right there in the cove. It's such a vivid picture of the improvisation and, well, the madness of the time.
But all that money flowing in must have started to build something more permanent eventually.
It did. The sheer volume of people and wealth spurred crucial infrastructure development. A big one was the Panama Railway, finished in 1855.
Across Panama.
Yeah, combined with steamships on both oceans, it dramatically cut travel time between San Francisco and the East Coast. That was huge.
And then there was more mining wealth, even after the initial gold rush.
Right, the Comstock lode discovery in Nevada in 1859. Massive silver deposit. San Francisco became the financial center for that wealth, too. So it started shifting from just a boomtown supporting miners to a more sophisticated metropolis. Finance, Speculation became major forces.
So the city's elite started to change.
Yeah, the narrative shifts. It wasn't just about the guys digging for gold anymore. The real players became the bankers funding the mines, the speculators trading claims, the lawyers handling disputes, the big merchants.
And the city started getting fancier.
Definitely. All that wealth fueled a thriving hospitality sector. You read descriptions of splendid restaurants and great hotels. This period, say from the mid-1850s onward, is really the birth of modern San Francisco as the West Coast's major financial and commercial hub.
But that incredibly fast, uncontrolled growth, it must have had a dark side. Social problems?
Oh, absolutely. Severe challenges. You cram that many people, mostly single men seeking quick riches, into one place with little established order, you get widespread crime, poverty.
How bad was the crime?
Some historical accounts are pretty shocking. One source mentions some 1,400 murders in just 6 years leading up to 1856, and very few convictions.
1,400. Wow. That's like wartime levels.
It led to a breakdown of official law enforcement and the rise of these powerful vigilance committees in the 1850s.
Vigilantes.
Basically, yeah. Citizen groups taking the law into their own hands, dispensing what's described as crude and extra-legal justice, public hangings, things like that.
Why was it so hard to establish order?
Well, the population was so transient, everyone was caught up in the gold rush fever. It made it incredibly difficult for stable communities, social bonds, effective government to really take root. It really shows the intense instability that can come with that kind of rapid, speculative boom.
Okay, so despite that early chaos, by 1870, San Francisco was clearly established, nearly 150,000 people, the main hub on the Pacific.
For sure, its deepwater harbor was just invaluable for trade, shipping goods from the West out across the Pacific and beyond. It built strong international trade ties, especially with Great Britain, which was a huge economic power then.
And its role as a financial center grew.
Yes, fueled by mining, wealth, and trade, it became a really significant financial center, quite independent from the East Coast markets in many ways.
And that independence actually helped it sometimes.
It did. Interestingly, during the Panic of 1893, a major nationwide depression, San Francisco and the West Coast banks actually weathered the panic well.
Why was that?
Because they weren't as tightly interwoven with the failing Eastern financial system. This actually forced the region to, as one source puts it, build up its own capital and develop its own network of banks centered in San Francisco. It created this robust, somewhat self-sufficient financial ecosystem.
And you saw that confidence reflected in the city itself.
Yeah, by the 1920s, you see new symbols of that status, like impressive high-rise office towers, the Rust Building being a prime example, clearly marking it as the business and financial capital of the West.
But then came the city's greatest test, 1906.
The Great Earthquake and Fire, April 18th, 1906. A catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. The quake itself did massive damage, but the fires that broke out afterwards, fueled by broken gas lines, lack of water, they just consumed the city's core.
The devastation must have been total in some areas?
Absolutely. Over half the population was displaced. Thousands died. Estimates vary. Something like 28,000 buildings destroyed. 2/3 of the city's residents were left homeless, just gone.
And yet, the city rebuilt. Famously resilient.
Its resilience was incredible. Rebuilding started almost immediately. There was this tremendous determination plus significant outside aid, and crucially, the disaster forced real change.
Like what?
Major reforms in building codes, making structures safer, better emergency preparedness planning, and it had this unexpected effect on public transit. The earthquake destroyed many of the powerhouses for the existing cable car system. Suddenly, electric streetcars, which some had resisted because the overhead wires were seen as unsightly, became the practical necessity.
Ah, so the quake forced the switch?
Pretty much. The main transit company, United Railroads, rapidly converted lines to electric. They proved faster, carried more people, were cheaper to run. This expansion of electric streetcars didn't just replace the cable cars, it extended transit out further, helping the city grow into new neighborhoods. So the earthquake, paradoxically, removed obstacles and spurred modernization.
And other big infrastructure projects kept reshaping the region. The bridges.
Oh, absolutely transformative. The Bay Bridge connecting to Oakland and the East Bay opened in 1936. Then, the iconic Golden Gate Bridge in 1937, linking to Marin County and the north.
Ending the city's relative isolation by water.
Exactly. They made large-scale automobile traffic feasible, opening up huge areas for suburban development, creating new regional economies. Of course, the flip side, eventually, was more traffic congestion within the city itself.
And older transit groundwork continued too.
Yeah, some rail lines laid down earlier actually formed the basis for parts of today's mini metro system.
What about the World Wars? Did they impact the city significantly?
Very much so. The Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915 celebrated the Panama Canal opening, a big moment. But World War II had an even more profound, lasting impact.
Ow.
San Francisco's location made it a vital staging area, a major port of embarkation for the Pacific Theater. The wartime economy led to huge shipyards being built all around the bay.
Bringing in workers.
Massive numbers. Around 500,000 workers came from all over the country. And many of them stayed permanently after the war, fundamentally changing the city's demographics and its economy. It's another example of that recurring theme. Major external events acting as engines for San Francisco's growth and transformation.
Okay, moving into the mid-20th century, San Francisco really starts to gain this reputation as a cultural hub, a place of change.
It really does. The 1950s see this vibrant bohemian scene emerge, centered in North Beach. This becomes the incubator for the beat movement.
Ginsberg, Kerouac.
Exactly. The clubs and cafes there were the venues for writers, poets, but also groundbreaking comedians like Lenny Bruce, Phyllis Diller, people pushing boundary.
And that energy just explodes in the 1960s.
Exponentially. The Haight-Ashbury district becomes the absolute global epicenter of the hippie counterculture.
The Summer of Love.
1967. Tens of thousands of young people, flower children, converge there, drawn by this mix of community-seeking, spiritual exploration, and protest, especially against the Vietnam War and mainstream values.
And psychedelic drugs were a big part of that scene.
Deeply intertwined, figures like Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey were influential. It added this whole layer of altered perception, mysticism, and you saw its influence everywhere. Music transformed into acid rock.
Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead.
Local bands that became huge. Promoted by figures like Bill Graham at venues like the Fillmore, they totally redefined live music, long improvisations, light shows, a much more interactive experience. Fashion changed too, tie-dye, long hair, and it radically challenged traditional ideas about sex and relationships.
So it wasn't just about peace and love beads. It was political, too.
Very much so. The counterculture was really a holistic critique of society. The cultural stuff, the drugs, the fashion, the music, communal living. These were all forms of dissent against the establishment, against consumerism, against the war. Culture was politics for them.
And San Francisco was also a hub for other major social movements around that time.
Definitely. It was often ahead of the curve. For example, it was an early adopter of busing students for school desegregation.
Controversial, but progressive for the time.
Yes, and you saw really important environmental movements taking root in the mid-60s. Groups like the Save the Bay Association fought successfully to protect the Bay from being filled in for development. The Bay Conservation and Development Commission was formed, real landmark environmental action.
And LGBTQ rights.
A pioneering role. San Francisco was one of the earliest and most visible centers for the burgeoning LGBTQIA+ rights movement. Activism there laid crucial groundwork for the national movement that followed.
Then in the 70s, we see big changes in infrastructure again. BART.
Right. The Bay Area Rapid Transit System was completed, a regional rail network. That was huge for commuting and eventually became, as some say, a backbone for downtown's ultimate economic resurgence.
And people actually stopped freeways from being built.
Yeah, the famous freeway revolt. Unlike many American cities that got sliced up by highways, citizen activism in San Francisco successfully halted several major freeway projects. The most famous was stopping the Embarcadero Freeway from extending along the waterfront.
That's amazing. Real people power changing the physical city.
It really highlights that strong tradition of activism in San Francisco, people organizing and having a direct impact on urban planning, preserving parts of the city's character.
Okay, that brings us closer to the present. Late 20th, early 21st century, the digital age arrives.
Another massive transformation, the dot-com boom in the late 1990s. It brought this huge influx of money, opportunity, people, construction, and soaring property values.
Changing neighborhoods.
Totally. Areas like south of Market Soma, which had been more industrial, were completely remade into offices for tech startups and apartments for their workers.
But like the gold rush,
Yeah.
it didn't last.
Nope. The bubble burst spectacularly in the early 2000s. Major economic downturn followed. And it's striking, isn't it, how much it echoes that gold rush pattern.
Boom and bust.
Exactly. Rapid expansion, driven by a new kind of gold, this time digital wealth, speculation, massive influx of people chasing it, then a crash.
Does that suggest something fundamental about the city's economy?
It seems to. That historical gold rush ethos, the rapid wealth generation, the high-risk investment, the speculative fever, it feels like a persistent thread. It just keeps manifesting in different industries, leading to these intense boom-bust cycles.
But despite the busts, San Francisco cemented its place as a global tech hub.
No question. It's deeply linked with Silicon Valley to the south, but SF has its own deep tech roots.
Going back further than computers.
Way further. Over a century. Early amateur radio enthusiasts, then crucial vacuum tube development during World War II, and then the real breakthrough. Robert Noyce inventing the integrated circuit at Fairchild Semiconductor in 1958.
The microchip.
Which launched the whole microelectronics revolution. That laid the groundwork for everything that followed: personal computers, the internet.
And today, the big tech names are all there.
Absolutely. Apple, Google, Meta, Lyft, Salesforce, countless others. The 2010s saw another huge tech boom, attracting massive venture capital, especially now in AI, which is expected to drive a lot of future growth. You see companies like Apple focusing heavily on AI and things like their Vision Pro headset, much of it developed right there in the Bay Area.
What drives that constant innovation?
It's this unique ecosystem. World-class universities like Stanford and Santa Clara, plus this culture where academics actively encourage and even invest in student startups, like Frederick Terman did back at Stanford decades ago.
And all this growth has meant big demographic shifts, too.
Huge shifts. Between 2010 and 2019, the city's population grew, mostly thanks to international migration. But even before the pandemic, an interesting trend started. More people were moving out of SF to other parts of the U.S. than moving in domestically, from about 2016 onwards.
And COVID accelerated that outflow.
Dramatically. Between 2020 and 2021 alone, the city saw a net loss of over 54,000 people. Job losses in some sectors, the rise of remote work letting people live anywhere, plus temporary limits on international migration all played a role.
So the city's makeup has changed significantly.
Very much so. It's now a minority-majority city. The percentage of non-Hispanic European Americans has dropped significantly, down to around 36.5% in 2024, compared to over 90% back in 1940.
Are the largest groups now?
Residents of Chinese descent form the largest single minority group, about 21% in 2010. They're concentrated in historic Chinatown, but also large communities in the Sunset and Richmond districts. There's also a very large Filipino population throughout the Bay Area.
And other groups have declined.
Notably, the African-American population has seen a really significant decline over decades, from over 13% in 1970 down to about 6% by 2010. High costs, gentrification are often cited as major factors pushing people out.
So those population numbers, especially people leaving for other parts of the U.S., really point to affordability issues.
Yeah, they're a clear indicator. Despite being this global magnet for talent and investment, the city's becoming increasingly challenging for many domestic residents to afford. It raises questions about who gets to live and thrive there.
Which brings us squarely to the really tough, visible urban problems San Francisco faces now.
They are significant and they are visible. The housing crisis is probably number one. Skyrocketing rents, a chronic lack of affordable housing, gentrification displacing long-term residents. It's deeply entrenched.
And it affects some communities more than others.
Disproportionately. The systemic failure to build enough affordable housing hits communities of color hardest. Black residents face, as studies show, heightened challenges with homeownership and just basic affordability.
And that can expect a history, doesn't it?
Correctly. Things like historical housing segregation, discriminatory practices like redlining, where banks refused loans in minority neighborhoods, these things created wealth gaps and barriers to housing access that still echo today.
Is there data showing that impact now?
Yes. One stark statistic is the loss of over 5,000 Black-owned households just in the 2010s. It's tangible evidence of how past injustices continue to shape present-day inequality.
And homelessness. It's impossible to ignore.
It's a persistent and incredibly complex crisis. A large, visible homeless population. Encampments shift, but the problem remains. Programs like Street to Home exist, but they're often under-resourced or face bureaucratic hurdles. You have this situation where thousands of supportive housing units might sit vacant while people remain on the streets.
So the response isn't really solving it systemically.
Often described as perpetually reactive. More about managing or moving the visible problem, redistributing, rather than resolving it at its roots.
Which seems to highlight this central paradox in modern San Francisco.
It really does. You have this global epicenter of wealth, of innovation, pushing the future forward. And right alongside it, you have these profound, deeply rooted social inequalities. The housing crisis, homelessness, the legacy of discrimination. It's a stark contrast.
And maybe that gold rush ethos we talked about plays into this paradox.
It feels deeply connected, that culture emphasizing rapid wealth, intense competition, individual opportunity. It seems to clash in some ways with the kind of collective responsibility and systemic thinking needed to tackle issues like poverty and housing insecurity for everyone.
Like the drive for individual success makes it harder to address collective problems.
It suggests a potential misalignment, perhaps, between the city's dominant economic engine and its capacity, or maybe its collective will, to ensure that prosperity is shared more equitably, to foster well-being for all residents, not just the winners of the latest rush.
So looking back, San Francisco's story is just incredible, this constant reinvention, adapting over centuries.
It really is a testament to that capacity. From its geography shaping its destiny, waves of migration constantly changing its face, that amazing resilience after the 1906 quake, the boom and bust cycles, being this hotbed of social change. It's a unique urban tapestry.
And today, it embodies this striking paradox. Unbelievable wealth right next to profound social challenges.
A paradox perhaps rooted, as we discuss, in that persistent gold rush ethos, which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a really challenging thought. How does a city so defined by that individualistic pursuit of fortune navigate the urgent need for collective action, for social equity, to solve its deepest problems today? It's the tension that continues to shape the city by the bay.